Are relative pronouns confusing? Do you get confused when to use who, whom, whose, which, that? Well, then this lesson is for you. Today I'll teach their differences and how to use these words correctly, which will in turn help you to improve your English speaking and writing skills. Welcome, I'm Seema from Edufinite. If you have any queries, you can ask me in the comments section. Without much ado, let's delve into the topic. Relative pronouns. Well, before we proceed further, pronouns are words which are used instead of a noun. Now, then what is a relative pronoun? Well, a relative pronoun is a type of pronoun that is used at the beginning of a relative clause. Now, what is a relative clause? It is a dependent clause. Now, what is a clause? A clause is a group of words which has a subject and a finite verb. And a clause which cannot give us the whole idea or does not make complete sense by itself is called a dependent clause. So, relative pronoun is a type of pronoun that is placed at the beginning of a relative clause. Next, how does it function? Or what is its use? It helps us to relate or connect the clause to the noun or pronoun of the independent clause that it modifies within a sentence. So as I told you, that relative pronoun is attached to a dependent clause, which is also called the relative clause. Why is it called a relative clause? Well, it is called a relative clause because the pronoun, the relative pronoun in it, what does it do? It relates. That means it establishes a connection with the noun. Which noun? Of the independent clause or of the other clause that is attached to it, because a dependent clause will never give the meaning on its own. So it has to be attached to another independent or another clause to give a complete meaning. Now the clause that is attached to it, the noun present in that clause, will be linked by this relative pronoun in the relative clause or the dependent clause. Now, what is its function? What will it do? It will modify the noun present in that independent clause. So it functions like an adjective, hence the clause it forms is also called the adjective clause. Because it is modifying a noun, and which words modify noun? Adjectives. So it's performing the role of an adjective, being a relative pronoun, but it functions like an adjective. So the clause which it heads is also known as adjective clause. So the clauses that begin with relative pronouns are known as relative clause. And since they tell us more about the noun present in the sentence, that is, they modify the noun or they give us more information about the noun, so they work as an adjective. Hence, this type of clause is also called an adjective clause. Now, let's look into a sentence to understand it better. For example, Jenny is a friend. Now, Jenny is a friend gives us a complete idea where Jenny is the subject and is the finite verb. So, this is an independent clause. Now, we can attach a relative clause or a dependent clause to it to expand the sentence, and we can say, who is always there for me? So, who is always there for me is the dependent clause, because who is always there for me does not make sense by itself. And this clause is headed by the relative pronoun who, and that is telling us about whom. This who is telling us more about the noun friend. Jenny is a friend. What type of friend? Who is always there for me. So this is how a relative pronoun works. Now, let's learn a little bit more about them. So the 5 basic relative pronouns are, first is who. Now generally used for people. We do not use it for things or animals as such, but there is an exception, though can be used for animals if they are referred by name. So if we refer our pet animals by name, in that case we can use relative pronoun who to tell more about that pet. But if we refer to animals in general, we cannot use who. It's only for people. And it is used both as a subject pronoun and the object pronoun as well. Next, we'll look into the sentences a little bit later, so we'll understand it much better then. But first, let's know the 5 basic relative pronouns. Next, we have whom. Now, whom is the object form of who, and it is generally used for people, so it's an object pronoun. Next, we have whose. Now, this is a possessive form of who, so used for possession, can be used for people, animals or things. It can relate to a person or animal or a thing, and this is a possessive pronoun. Next, we have which is used for animals in general or things in non-restrictive or non-defining relative clauses. So this is also a subject as well as an object pronoun. Regarding this non-restrictive and non-defining, I'll tell about it later on, but first let's move further and know the next one. The next one is that. Now this is used for people and things in restrictive and defining relative clauses only, and it is also used as a subject pronoun as well as the object pronoun. Now regarding subject pronoun and object pronoun, if you have any confusion, you can check my videos on them, as well as if you have any confusion regarding clauses or adjective clauses, you can check my videos on them. Okay. Now regarding restrictive or defining relative clause, actually relative clause is called restrictive relative clause when that clause is an essential part of that sentence. That means it's not giving an extra information about the noun that it is modifying. Rather, it is giving the identity. It is revealing the identity of the noun it is modifying. So it's an integral part of that sentence. So this type of relative clause are called restrictive or defining relative clause. And the relative clause that is not an integral part of the sentence, that means it is giving some additional information about the noun it is modifying. Without that information, the sentence will have its meaning. So that's not the integral part of the sentence. So then we call that relative clause as non-restrictive relative clause or non-defining relative clause. Now let's move on to the examples of relative pronouns to understand them much better. So examples using who, which is used as a subject pronoun as well as an object pronoun. So the first one is, the man who fixed my broken phone is my neighbor. So here in this sentence, who fixed my broken phone, this is the dependent clause which is headed by the relative pronoun who. So who fixed my broken phone is the relative clause. And it tells us more about the noun, the man. From the independent clause, the man is my neighbor. So the independent clause, I have used bold letters for them. And for the dependent or the relative clause, I have used regular letters and I have underlined it. So you can differentiate between the two clauses because the relative clause is often inserted within the independent clause. So here, what is happening? Who is the relative clause attached to fix my broken phone. So who fixed my broken phone is the relative clause which is functioning as an adjective because it tells us more about the man. It tells us the identity of the man. Which man? The man is my neighbor, but which man? The man is my neighbor is not establishing the identity of the man. So the identity of the man is revealed by this relative clause. who fixed my broken phone? The next sentence. The loud crashing noise startled our dog Max, who was sleeping on the rug. So here what do we see? The independent clause is the loud crashing noise startled our dog Max. Now this has enough information about our dog Max, and as I told you, here our dog, a pet dog, has his name written in this sentence. Our pet dog is called by its name Max. So here we can use who as a relative pronoun when we are telling more about our dog Max. So the loud crashing noise startled our dog Max, who was sleeping on the rug. So who was sleeping on the rug is the relative clause or the adjective clause headed by the relative pronoun who, and it is modifying the noun our dog Max because it is telling us more about our dog Max. What was our dog Max doing? The dog was sleeping on the rug. So this is an extra information. For that reason, we have put a comma before we have started this relative clause. Next we have, the girl who just boarded the plane is my batchmate. So here again, the girl is my batchmate is the independent clause, and who just boarded the plane is the relative clause or the adjective clause headed by the relative pronoun who. Now, this relative clause is modifying, or the relative pronoun who is modifying the noun girl, the girl. So it is telling us which girl? The girl who just boarded the plane. So we are, establishing the identity of the noun the girl. So this is the job of a relative pronoun. Okay, now let's move on to the next one. Examples using whom, which is an object pronoun. The witness whom the lawyer cross-examined gave conflicting evidence. So in this sentence, the witness gave conflicting evidence is the independent clause, and whom the lawyer cross-examined is the relative clause or the adjective clause headed by the relative pronoun whom. And whom tells us more about the noun the witness. So whom here is the object pronoun because it is the object of the verb examined. The lawyer examined whom? The witness. So this is the object pronoun. Okay, this is the object of the verb examined. Okay, the next sentence. The officer with whom I spoke was able to help me. So in this sentence, whom I spoke was able to help me is the relative clause headed by the relative pronoun whom. And whom over here is the object of the preposition with, the officer with whom I spoke. So whom over here is the object of the preposition. So these are the two ways how we can use the relative pronoun whom. Next we have examples using whose. So the next examples are of the relative pronoun whose. Now this is also used as a subject pronoun or as an object pronoun. Next we have the book whose cover is red is the one I wanted to read. The book is the one I wanted to read is the independent clause, and whose cover is red is the dependent clause headed by the relative pronoun whose. Now whose is giving the identity or modifying the noun the book. So that is the function of a relative pronoun. Next we have the police are looking for the car whose driver had rammed my car. So the police are looking for the car. Which car? Whose driver had rammed my car. So here whose is the relative pronoun. Now this is the possessive form of the word who. So the book, which book? Whose cover is red. And in the next sentence, the police is looking for which car? Whose driver had rammed my car. So is looking for that particular car. Okay. Next we have examples using which. Now, which is also used as a subject as well as an object pronoun. So, Roshan bought the top hybrid car, which will help him save on fuel. So here, Roshan bought the top hybrid car is the independent clause. It's giving the full meaning. And then we are telling a little bit more. We are describing the top hybrid car a little more. So what are we telling about it? Which will help him save on fuel. So the top hybrid car will help him save on fuel. So which is the relative pronoun. And since this is an extra information, so this is a non-restrictive relative clause and we can use only which for that. Next is our washing machine, which was very old, stopped working. So over here also our washing machine stopped working is the independent clause and which was very old is the dependent or the relative clause headed by the relative pronoun which. Now, which was very old is also a non-restrictive relative clause since this is giving an extra information about our washing machine, which was very old. So this is not an integral part of the sentence. So we use which for such situations. And next we have the phone which I use is quite old. Now here the phone is quite old is the independent clause, which I use is the relative clause headed by the relative pronoun which. Now over here you notice that which I use is establishing the identity of the phone. If I just say the phone is quite old, then you will not be able to understand which phone. So to establish its identity, I have to add which I use. So when I say the phone which I use is quite old, you understand the identity of the phone. Which phone? The phone that I am using. So which I use is the integral part of the sentence. So this is a restrictive clause. And in such cases, this restrictive clause can also be replaced by that. You can also say the phone that I use is quite old. Okay. Next, we move on to examples using that, which is also a subject as well as an object pronoun. So this is the house that my father built. Now, relative pronoun is that, which heads the relative clause my father built. And this is the house is the independent clause. Now that relative pronoun over here is telling us more about the noun the house. Which house? The house that my father built. So next we have the phone that I use is quite old. So here, as I told you earlier, the phone which I use is quite old. It can be replaced by that because that I use is a restrictive clause. So that is always used for restrictive clause. So we can use which also, but for a non-restrictive or for a non-defining clause or a non-essential clause, we have to use which only in such cases. Next, we have things to keep in mind. That versus which. So there is a little bit of confusion when to use that and when to use which, as I was telling. So the presence of that indicates the clause is essential or restrictive. So if that is there in the sentence, then without fail that clause is an essential part of that sentence. So it is an essential or restrictive clause. Lorna wore the dress that she bought in Paris. So if I just say Lorna wore the dress, you won't be able to understand which dress. So I have to describe it or establish its identity, and then I add the restrictive clause that she bought in Paris. Immediately it strikes a chord and you can relate to it, okay, that particular dress. So this is very much needed by the sentence. So this is the restrictive clause, as I was saying, which is an integral part of the sentence. You cannot do without it. The meaning won't be complete. Next we have only which is used in non-essential or non-restrictive clause. Now in the first sentence you can replace it with which if you want. Lorna wore the dress which she bought in Paris. When it's an integral part of the sentence, we usually use that with it. And when it is not an integral part of the sentence, we only use which in that case. We never use that over there. For example, Lorna wore her most expensive dress which she bought in Paris. So Lorna wore her most expensive dress. Now if we just say this much, the sentence is complete. When we say which she bought in Paris, that's an additional information about that dress. So it is a non-restrictive clause. So a non-restrictive clause is always separated. You put a comma before starting the non-restrictive clause. Now over here, you can never write that. You can never say Lorna wore her most expensive dress that she bought in Paris. That will be absolutely wrong. Because with non-restrictive clause, we only use which. And if that is present in any clause, that means in any relative clause or adjective clause, in that case, it immediately will tell us that that is a restrictive clause or an essential clause. Okay. The next point is who versus whom. Now, some of you do get confused. So here are a few tips. Use who if the relative pronoun is the subject of the verb in the dependent clause. For example, the girl who just boarded the plane is my batchmate. Now here, who is the subject of the verb boarded in the dependent clause or the relative clause. So when it is the subject, where we have to place a relative pronoun, so you without any doubt put who, because who is a subject pronoun. It is an object pronoun also, but it is a subject pronoun. So when you have to place a relative pronoun and you have to choose between who and whom, if it's the subject of the dependent clause, then without any thought, you just put who over there. Then it will be correct. The next one is use whom if the relative pronoun is the object of the verb in the dependent clause. So if the relative pronoun is the object of the verb in the dependent clause, then you have to use the object pronoun, which is whom. So let's look into the sentence to understand it. The witness whom the lawyer cross-examined gave conflicting evidence. So, which is the verb over here? The verb is cross-examined. So the lawyer cross-examined whom? The witness. So here it is the object of the verb cross-examined. So hence we use whom. Next is use whom if the relative pronoun is the object of preposition in the dependent clause. So if it is the object of preposition, then what do? Then also we use whom. We never use who. So when you are in confusion between who and whom, who is only used when it is the subject of the dependent clause. And if it is the object of the dependent clause or it is the object of a preposition in the dependent clause, in that case you will have to use whom. So let's look into the sentence. The officer with whom I spoke was able to help me. So the relative pronoun over here, whom, is the object of the preposition with. That's all for today. Hope the lesson was useful. Let me know your thoughts about it in the comment section. I'll be back soon with a new video. Till then, take care, stay safe and be happy.